Hey, what's up everybody? This is Ray and welcome back to our Objective-C video tutorial series. In this video tutorial, we're going to take a deeper look at how Objective-C works behind the scenes by looking at the Objective-C runtime. In particular, we're going to look at how introspection works in Objective-C and take a look at message passing. Okay, so you've seen that categories are a way to extend the behavior of another class without actually subclassing it. But another handy thing to be able to do is sort of use introspection. And if you haven't heard of introspection before, the idea is it allows you at runtime to get information about the classes and methods inside your code. So there's lots of things. Objective-C has full support for introspection. There's lots of things here. We're just going to scratch the surface. So the first thing here is sometimes you want to know what some information about a class in your app. For example, you might want to know, given a class, what's its superclass? You can do that with a special object that's actually called class, which is an object that gives you information about the class of another object. So the way you can get a class object is calling a method on the object called class, and it will give you a class object back. And once you have one of these class objects, you can use a bunch of other methods to get information about the class, its superclass, what methods it has, anything you'd want to know. Another way to get a class object is there's this method nsClass from string. And this could be handy if you need to, figure out the name of the class at runtime. This might be useful, for example, if you're developing like a plug-in system into your app or something like that. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is this thing called Selector, and you've heard me mention selectors a few times in this video series so far. So you can think of as a selector as an internal ID for a method. So you should not really assume what the ID is behind the scenes. Don't even worry about that. Just know that if you want to get this internal ID for a method, you should use Selector. And the reason you shouldn't care about what it is behind the scenes is because that could change from version of OS to version of OS. So to get one of these selectors, you use the @selector keyword, and then you give the name of the method, and it gives you back one of these IDs. And alternatively, if you just want to get it from a string instead, you can do that with nsSelector from string. And the last thing that you should know about is just like there's a class to give you information about a class, there's another sort of meta class to give you information about a method. And not surprisingly, it's called method. And you can get it with this with this method called class get instance method. You pass in a class, you pass in the selector to the method you're interested in, you get back a method object. Once you have that method object, you can run all kinds of other functions to get more information about the method, such as how many arguments does it have, what are their types, etc. Okay, so in this next demo, I want to show you some of these cool introspection features we just talked about. So let's say we want to get some information about the date calculator class. So remember, there's a special class called capital class that represents information about a class, and you can give it a name. We'll call the variable myClass, and to get one, you just give whatever instance you're trying to get information about, so calc, and then you use the class method. Okay, so now we have the special variable called myClass, which we can get some information about. So one of the things you can get of many things, so a way you can see all the things you can do is if you use class underscore get, and it's not working for me because I have to import a header file. I have to import Objective-C message.h. Now if I type class underscore, I see there's tons of functions here that I can use to get information about classes. You can see I can get the name, the property, the superclass, and actually this is the one we want right here. Let's figure out what the superclass is programmatically of date calculator. So if I call this and pass in my class, it's going to give me back another class. I'll call it superclass. And for now, all I want to do is log out the name of that superclass. To convert a class object to a string, there's this handy method called nsString from class. And I'll pass in my class for the first one, and then I'll just repeat that again for the superclass. Okay, so if I run this, it says the superclass of date calculator is NSObject. So the cool thing about this is this is all done completely at runtime. So we could have run the same code on any class, and this is useful for making utilities that sort of inspect apps or all sorts of reasons you might want to use this. Okay, that's the first thing, looking at the special class object. Let's look at selectors now. So there's a special type for selectors called capital SEL. And again, you should not assume what this is behind the scenes. And we'll give it a name. And to get a selector, you can use the @selector keyword, and then you just type in the name of the method. And so let's use the should he date if her age is 1. And this method just takes a single parameter, and you put a colon to indicate that it has a single parameter coming. And then we can log that out. And to convert a selector to a string, similarly, there's a NSString from selector method, and we pass in the selector. So if I run that, it says the selector is should he date if her name is. You might say, what's the point of this? Well, there's a lot of methods that you'll see in Objective-C that take a selector as a parameter. So you have to know how to work with selectors, and this is the way you do it. Just use the @selector keyword. And there's also a NS selector from string. If you programmatically you had the name of a method you were trying to call. Okay, the last thing I want to show you in this demo is the method special class. And you can get one of these by saying class get instance method, and you pass in the class here. So we want my class, or we could say calc class, either way. And then you give it the selector you want. So let's get the selector for his name. Remember, we have a property on date calculator called his name that generates a getter and a setter. The name of the getter is his name. So there you go. And you can get all kinds of useful information about the method. Similarly, just use method underscore and you'll see all the cool things you can get about them. One of them is get number of arguments. Let's try out that one. And pass in the method object here. And it's going to return a number of how many arguments this thing has. So let's just log that out. Okay, so you might wonder, why does it take 2 arguments? The reason is behind the scenes, when you call a method in Objective-C, it's actually going to go through this process called message passing. And the way message passing works is it calls this method called Objective-C message send. And that method always takes, the first 2 arguments are always going to be the class you're trying to call the method on, and then the name of the method you're trying to call, and then all of the arguments. So even if a method has no parameters, the first 2 arguments are always going to be the class you're trying to call and the method you're trying to call, so the message passing works. And you'll see this more when we get into message passing. Okay, so what I just showed you was sort of the scratching the surface of some of the cool introspection stuff you can use in Objective-C. Now in a typical app, you don't really need to use that stuff too much. That's useful stuff sometimes if you want to do some fancy plugin type features in your app, but they're good to know about, which is why I mentioned them here. Now, what I'm going to show you right here are the things that you typically do want to use on a regular basis in app development. And they're kind of what I call like introspection light type things. So first of all, a lot of times you have an object and you want to know what kind of an object is this? What kind of class is this object here? So there's 2 things you can use to test that. The first is member of class, and that says, is it this exact class? So you could have an object and say, is this NSString? Okay, and it would say yes or no. And then the next thing is kind of class, and that's similar, but it also says yes to if you're inheriting from that class. So for example, if you had NSString and you said, is kind of class NS object, it would return yes because it inherits from NS object. But if you did the previous one, which is member of class, it would say no because it's not exactly an NS object, it's actually an NS string. So it depends on what you want, but more typically, it's more commonly useful to use it as kind of class for most problems that you run into. Another sort of introspection light features that you'll commonly use is you will have a class and you want to know, does it implement a method? An example of this is, say you have a protocol like we discussed in a previous video, and you want to know, hey, did this implementation of this protocol, did they implement this optional method? You can query. You can say, does it respond to the selector? And then you put the name of the optional method. And if that returns yes, then you know, hey, that method has an implementation, so it's safe for me to call this method. And you can either call it directly, or you can say perform selector, which is kind of an indirect way to call a method. Okay, let me show you some of the more typical use cases of introspection. So first of all, we'll take a look at the is member of class and is kind of class. So what we're going to do is we're going to say member of NS object, and then true or false, and then we'll just see if the date calculator is member of class NS object class. And then I'm just going to repeat this exact same bit of code, but I'm going to, instead of is member of class, let's put in is kind of class. And I think you should remember what this should print out from our slides. So is it a member of NS object? No. But is it a kind of NS object? Yes. So member of object, no. Kind of object, yes. Okay. And then let's test if a class responds to a selector. So if calc responds to selector his name, then we can say his name equals calc perform selector. And you see there's a whole lot of different options here, and you'll see these used quite a bit in iOS development because you can perform a selector after delay or passing with argument, wait until the method is done, whatever. So we're going to use the regular perform selector with object variant and pass in his name and nil for the object. And the method call works just as usual. But the advantage of doing it this way is you're completely dynamic. You might not know when you're writing the code if the object that you're testing actually responds to a particular method, but at runtime you can run this test and make sure that it does in order to safely call it. Now, the reason this is important is if you didn't check like this, and you were to call a selector that doesn't exist, like that, it actually would crash your app. And down here in the messages, you're going to see unrecognized selector set to instance. Okay, so what that means, you'll see this probably quite a bit. It's a common error in iOS development. And what this means is you're trying to call a method on an object that doesn't exist. Okay, next let's take a look at what happens when you call a method in Objective-C. Now, if you're new to Objective-C, you might think it works like it does in other programming languages. You might think when you call a method, all the compiler does is jump your code from its current location to the code where the implementation of the method is. But actually, it doesn't work that way in Objective-C. When you call a method, behind the scenes, the compiler will actually rewrite that code for you into a method call that looks like this, called Objective-C message send. And the first two parameters of this method are always going to be the class you're calling a method on, followed by the method you're trying to call, followed by all of the arguments. Now, actually, there's a couple variants of Objective-C message send here. There's different versions of this based on the return type of the method that you're calling, but for now, just think of it as Objective-C message counter for the send for the simple case. And what Objective-C message send does is it goes to look up in a special table called the dispatch table where to jump to. And the dispatch table has a list of all the selectors on the object, and then for each selector, a pointer to where the code is for that selector. So you might think, what's the point of doing it this way? This is adding another layer of indirection and might be making my code slower because of this. Well, actually, this process is very efficient and very optimized. The lookups are very quick, they're hashed, and they're even cached. So this usually is not the bottleneck of your application, but instead it actually lets you do some very cool things. This is how categories work. Let me show you an example of what this lets you do. So say you add a category to an object, and what that's actually doing is it's adding another entry into the dispatch table for the new method you're adding. So in this example, another method was added to the object called alt do it with a, and it points to the categories implementation of that. Well, one of the things you can do with this dispatch table is you can programmatically swap where the implementation, where the pointers are pointing to. So for example, you could swap the pointer from do it with a to alt do it with a, and you could make the alt do it with a point to do it with a. So now when someone calls do it with a, they're going to jump to the code where alt do it with a is. And this is a good opportunity for you if you wanted to kind of inspect what's going on with an object for debugging purposes, for example. So in this example, it logs out what the value passed in is, and then it calls the original method. And you might say, wait a minute, that doesn't look like the original method. This looks like it's a recursive function call. But remember, when you call self alt do it with a, that's going to go to the dispatch table, and because you've swapped the pointers, it goes to what the original implementation was, so you're all good. Okay, in this last demo, I want to show you a little bit more about Objective-C message send. Okay, so when you're calling something like this, what the compiler is going to do is it's going to rewrite that line of code for you. So let's get this line working first. So if I run this, it says his name, Ray. Okay. Now, but what the compiler is actually doing for you is it's completely rewriting this line of code to call Objective-C message send. So it's exactly equivalent to Objective-C message send. And remember, the first argument when you call this is always the object you're sending the message to, which is calc. And then it's the selector you're trying to call, which is his name. And then if you had any arguments, you would list them out here, but of course we don't, so that's it. And I'm going to run that again. And it works just as before, okay? And let me show you a slightly more complicated version of this. So Objective-C message send, it returns an ID, okay? But you might wonder, what do you do if it returns something else other than an object, such as a Boolean? And in fact, we have that case for date calculator. So the should he date of her ages method, it returns a Boolean. So for that to work, you have to be a little bit fancy. So should date equals, you want to call Objective-C message send, calc, selector, should I date of her ages, and then, pass in your argument here. But it's going to give you a warning that's saying, basically, it's an incompatible pointer because it's returning, this is supposed to be returning an ID, but you're expecting to return to a bool. So what you have to do is you have to cast this function to be returning a Boolean instead of an ID. And the syntax is a little weird, but it looks like this. And I run and everything works as usual. Okay, one last thing. Let's say that a certain government organization has infiltrated our app here. So I'm going to copy in these files from the secret government organization, and it's called date calculator plus spy editions. Okay, and just like we talked about in the slides, I've created a special method here called should he date of her ages. And what this does is it calls the original method. Now remember, it looks like it's calling this method, but because we're going to swap them, it's going to call the original method. And it does some secret government agency stuff here. So it says if her age is less than 18, oh my gosh, I'm supposed to be a pervert. I'm going to add this to the secret database. Okay. So let's say this government agency wants to intercept every single call to date calculator, so it goes to the spy function instead. So we can do that with method swizzling. And the way this works is if I go back here, I can get the method I want to replace. And you know how to do that. You say class get instance method. Let me call it original. And you pass in date calculator class, and then the method we want to replace, the selector for it, is should he date of her ages. And then we do the same thing, but for the new method. And so up here I got to import date calculator plus spy editions.h. And down here I'm going to replace this with spy should he date of her ages, and we'll call this one the replacement. Okay, and now here's the trick. To swap these two methods, like we saw on the slides, you know how there's all these things you can do with methods we talked about, like getting a number of arguments? Well, there's another one in here called exchange implementations. So I can say exchange the original with the replacement. So that swaps those two arrows like you saw on the slides. And if I run this, now being a sneaky agency, everything seems to work as fine if everything's legit. But if I do something a little bit dodgy here, oh no, I've been caught. All right, that's it for this video tutorial. As always, I want to leave you guys off with a chance to play around with this on your own. Now, this is one of the more difficult challenges. It involves a little bit of knowledge of C and sort of experimentation on your own, but I think it's kind of fun and you'll enjoy it. What I want you to do is I want you to programmatically list out all of the methods inside date calculator. You're going to need to use the class copy method list and method getName functions to do this. It should be pretty cool. I hope you enjoy it, and thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.